Hello, and welcome to another episode of Levy Fam Creative. Today's story is Leroy, Lexi, and the Goblins. Leroy was a strong little boy. He liked to win, and he won all the time. Leroy won at races, he won at games, he won at puzzles, he won at life. Even when he lost, he won. Because if he lost, it meant the other person was a cheater. Leroy had a cousin named Lexi. Lexi was a smart little girl, a very smart little girl. Lexi knew about mammals and plants and history and math and hairstyles and lots of other things she liked to talk about. She wasn't always right, but she couldn't remember a time when she had ever been wrong. Sometimes, like today, their parents asked them to go outside and play together.
More like forced them.
Yeah. So they played. But it didn't go so well. They started fighting. Lexi shouted,
"Sore loser!"
Leroy shouted, "Know-it-all!" That's what got the attention of two goblins, Stank Eye and Muckmouth, who were wandering by. Before we go further, you'll need to know a thing or two about goblins. Goblins are mischievous. They are green. They have purple hair. They smell like rotten bananas. They're about 3 feet tall. They live underground. They love bad, yucky things and hate good, pretty things. Goblins love black licorice because it's gross. Dirt because it's dirty. Snakeskin because it's creepy. And naughty children because they're naughty. Stank Eye and Muckmouth had been sent by King Giblets, son of Niblets, to find a whole grocery list of different kinds of naughty children for the Goblin Zoo. They had already found a greedy kid, a red-faced tantrum kid, a hair-pulling kid, ouch, a toy-snatching kid, an I didn't do it lying kid, and many more. The last two kids on their list were a sore loser kid and a know-it-all kid. Lexi screamed,
"Sore loser!"
again, and Leroy screamed, "Know-it-all!" "This is horrible!" grinned Stank Eye. That means this is awesome in Goblinese. "What terrible luck!" smiled Muckmouth. That means what wonderful luck in Goblinese. They put Leroy and Lexi in their goblin bags and swooped them down to the goblin world. Leroy and Lexi ended up in a cage at the Goblin Zoo. Goblins came from far and wide to visit the Goblin Zoo. They like to walk around and eat popcorn seasoned with dirt, twigs, and swamp water. Doesn't that sound delicious?
No.
They like to suck on black licorice while wearing snakeskin pants. They like to stare at all the naughty children. Sitting in a cage made Leroy very mad. He shouted. The goblins loved it. He kicked. The goblins couldn't get enough. He thrashed. The goblins jumped with excitement. Little goblins tapped on the glass. Tink, tink, tink. Lexi was trying to use her smart brain to figure out a way out of this mess. "Be quiet so I can think," she snapped at Leroy. Leroy's face wrinkled up like a prune. He shouted, I will never do what you say. You're not the boss." Then they started fighting all over again, shouting, screaming, stomping their feet, even hitting each other. Ouch! The goblins roared with applause. Yeah! King Giblets came forward. He was bigger than the other goblins and wore a crown made of mud and tree bark and decorated with black licorice bits. He looked at Stank Eye and Muckmouth and said, "Truly terrible job. Terrible job indeed. These children are horrid." He gave the goblins each a muddy handshake and a snakeskin bag full of black licorice. Stank Eye and Muckmouth jumped up and down and said, "This is the worst day of our lives." Lexi looked out at all the smiling goblins. She looked at Leroy with his red, angry face. She took a deep breath and started to cry. Plump tears rolled down her cheeks.
I want to go home.
She said in a quiet, sad voice.
I want to go home.
Leroy stopped in his tracks. All his mean madness quickly turned into sadness. He loved his cousin Lexi. He didn't want her to cry. Why had he been so mean to her? The goblins were quiet. They didn't like where this was going. King Giblets said, "Go on, keep fighting, I command you." Instead, Leroy reached out and hugged his cousin. I'm sorry I was so mean to you, he said gently. The goblins gasped. They all took a step back from the cage. They didn't like that word, sorry. Mothers grabbed their little goblins and covered their ears. Lexi hugged Leroy right back and said,
I'm sorry I was bossing you.
King Giblet said, "Hey, you can't say those words down here. There are little ones for Bomboozle's sake." Leroy and Lexi saw that the goblins were getting restless. The cousins looked at each other and smiled.
I forgive you,
said Leroy.
I forgive you too,
said Lexi.
I love how smart you are,
said Leroy.
You're really strong and fast,
said Lexi. Bright yellow flowers began popping up out of the ground. Their kind words were magical in the goblin world. Goblins were running around holding their ears. They were trying to stomp out all the flowers, but there were too many. "Stop saying all those words!" yelled King Giblets. "You're unruining everything!" Suddenly, the kids in all the cages started shouting wonderful words too. "Love!" shouted one. "Kindness!" yelled another. These were followed by many others like joy, peace, and gentleness. Goblins were rolling on the ground, sucking their thumbs and calling for their mommies. Some were stuffing black licorice in their ears. Some were digging holes and hiding their heads.
Whoa!
A huge tree roared out of the ground. It had shimmering golden leaves. Birds were flying and singing in its branches. There was a face on the trunk with big golden eyes. "I hear my words," said the great king. His voice was like an earthquake of joy. All around there were many other trees. The trees were even growing inside of the kids' cages, breaking them apart. King Giblets just stood there with his mouth open. "The great king!" he cried. "Run away! Run away!" With that, he jumped in the air and dove into the ground. I forgot to tell you, goblins can swim in dirt. The other goblins followed. The great king smiled and said, "Climb into my branches, children, and I will take you home." He carried them all out of the goblin world and dropped them off at their houses. He hugged them, and his golden leaves tickled their faces. "Farewell," he said. "Remember my words."
I will remember.
Said Lexi.
I will remember,
said Leroy. Their hearts were full of the king's joy, like green grass and still water and blue sky. Leroy and Lexi held hands and walked slowly into the house, friends forever.
Best friends forever.
Yep.
The end.
The end. Good job.
The end.
The end.